Charleston Harbor, February 17th, 1864. The air is thick with the scent of salt and gunpowder as the moon casts a pale, cold light over the Atlantic. The city of Charleston, a jewel of the Confederacy, is gasping for air, strangled by a ring of Union iron. Massive warships like the USS Housatonic sit anchored just miles out, an immovable blockade that has turned the harbor into a cage. For years, naval warfare followed a rigid set of rules: wood and iron, broadsides, and boarding parties. But tonight, beneath the surface of the black water, a cigar-shaped iron coffin is about to rewrite history. This is the Hunley, a radical, hand-crank machine built out of desperation. Inside, 8 men are packed shoulder to shoulder in a space no larger than a boiler, their lungs burning as they turn a heavy iron crankshaft by hand. They are propelling a 135-pound charge of black powder directly toward the heart of the Union fleet. 3 times before, this vessel had become a tomb, sinking during trials and claiming 13 lives, including its own inventor. Yet, Lieutenant George Dixon and his 7 volunteers did not hesitate. As they approached the looming hull of the Housatonic, the tension inside the cramped hull is suffocating. They ram the spar torpedo into the Union ship's stern, back away, and pull the trigger line. A massive, concussive thud ripples through the water, and within 5 minutes, the Housatonic, one of the pride of the Union Navy, is at the bottom of the sea. It is the first time in human history a submarine has sunk an enemy warship. On the distant shore at Fort Moultrie, Confederate lookouts strain their eyes through the darkness, waiting for the prearranged signal. Then, it appears, a faint, ethereal blue light flickering across the waves. It is the signal of victory. The mission is a success. The crew is coming home. But as the minutes turn into hours, the cheers on the shore fade into a haunting silence. The blue light never reappears. The Hunley and her 8-man crew never surface at the dock. Despite the successful signal, the submarine has vanished into the silt and shadows of the harbor, leaving behind a paradox that would baffle historians for over a century. How does a vessel survive its own attack, signal its triumph to the shore, and then simply cease to exist? For 136 years, the Hunley remained a ghost of the Civil War, hidden under layers of sand and myth, until a forensic discovery in the year 2000 would finally reveal a scene inside the hull that no one expected. A frozen moment of death that challenged everything we thought we knew about the final moments of the world's first successful attack submarine. The hunt for the Hunley became a century-long obsession for wreck hunters and historians alike, fueled by the legend of the blue light. For decades, it was assumed the submarine had been pulled down by the suction of the sinking Housatonic or perhaps run over by a rescue vessel in the chaos. In 1995, after years of grueling magnetic surveys, author Clive Cussler's team finally located the wreck buried under 3 feet of silt, nearly 4 miles off the coast. When the vessel was finally raised from the seabed in 2000, the world held its breath. The recovery was a feat of modern engineering, lifting the fragile iron shell in a massive cradle to protect the secrets locked inside. As the submarine was transported to the Warren Lash Conservation Center, the atmosphere was more akin to a funeral than an archaeological dig. The researchers knew that they weren't just looking at a machine, they were looking at a grave. When archaeologists finally removed the iron plates to peer inside the hull, they braced themselves for a scene of maritime horror. In almost every shipwreck involving a sinking vessel, the interior tells a story of frantic, desperate struggle. Investigators expected to find the skeletal remains of the 8 men piled up near the hatches, their finger bones perhaps scarred from clawing at the sealed iron lids as the water rushed in. They expected to see the heavy iron crankshaft bent or the bilge pumps mangled from a last-ditch effort to save the boat. But as the sediment was painstakingly brushed away, a chilling and inexplicable tableau emerged. The crew was still at their stations. Lieutenant George Dixon was still in the pilot's seat. The 7 men behind him were still seated along the wooden bench, their hands near the crank. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of panic, and no attempt to escape. It was as if time had simply stopped for them in the middle of a heartbeat. This frozen state of the crew turned the mystery on its head. If the boat had flooded slowly, they would have scrambled for the exits. If they had run out of oxygen, they would have succumbed to carbon dioxide poisoning, which usually induces a gasping, panicked air hunger that would have seen them slumped over or moving toward the air valves. Instead, they looked like a crew that had simply fallen asleep at their posts. This forensic anomaly forced researchers to look away from traditional shipwreck causes and toward the physics of the explosion itself. The Hunley was found with its spar torpedo still attached to the bow, but the black powder charge had been detonated only 16 feet away. Using modern blast simulation software and scale models, researchers began to test a terrifying new hypothesis. The blast didn't just sink the Housatonic, it sent a high-pressure shock wave through the water and straight through the Hunley's iron hull. The science of blast lung suggests that the crew never knew what hit them. When a pressure wave hits a closed iron vessel submerged in water, the air inside doesn't compress. It transmits the energy. As the shock wave passed through the men's bodies, it would have reached the air-filled spaces of their lungs, causing the delicate tissues to rupture instantly. This would have filled their lungs with fluid and blood, causing immediate unconsciousness and a secondary, soft death. They didn't drown in the harbor. They were killed by the very victory they had just ignited. Yet, this scientific explanation creates a haunting friction with the historical record. If the crew was killed instantly by the blast pressure wave, then who signaled ashore? Who held up the blue lantern that the lookouts at Fort Moultrie swore they saw? The forensics say the men died at the moment of impact, but the witnesses say they survived long enough to say goodbye. The forensic team's attention shifted from the skeletal remains to the iron skin of the submarine itself. To the untrained eye, the hull looked remarkably intact for a vessel that had spent over a century under the silt, but microscopic analysis revealed a different story. The intake pipe for the aft ballast tank was sheared off, and several rivets had popped inward, likely from the force of the explosion. If the blast wave had indeed incapacitated the crew, the boat would have become a rudderless ghost, slowly taking on water through these minor breaches. Engineers calculated the distance from the torpedo to the bow and realized the Hunley was significantly closer to the blast than its designers had intended. The 135-pound black powder charge wasn't just a weapon against the Housatonic. It was a hammer blow against the Hunley's own hull. As the pressure wave traveled at 1,500 meters per second through the water, it didn't bounce off the iron. It passed through it like a ghost, entering the air-filled cabin where its energy was released into the only compressible thing available, the lungs of the crew. Yet, as the blast lung theory gained traction, researchers found a piece of evidence that threw the timeline back into chaos: the legendary blue light lantern. Recovered from the silt inside the submarine, the lantern was more than just a relic. It was a piece of the puzzle that refused to fit. Forensic examination of the lantern showed it had been found near the forward hatch, where Lieutenant Dixon sat. If the crew had been killed instantly by the shock wave, the lantern should have been stowed or fallen to the floor. Furthermore, the glass of the lantern was remarkably well preserved. If it had been used to signal the shore after the explosion, it meant someone, likely Dixon, was alive, conscious, and functioning minutes after the torpedo detonated. This led to a split in the scientific community. One camp pointed to the frozen positions as proof of instant death, while another argued that the crew might have survived the initial blast, realized they were taking on water, and simply succumbed to carbon dioxide poisoning while waiting for the tide to carry them home, too exhausted or disoriented to fight the hatches. The mystery of the blue light paradox remains the most haunting aspect of the Hunley story. If Dixon signaled Fort Moultrie, he did so while his boat was already mortally wounded. Perhaps he stood there, peering through the tiny glass viewports, watching the Housatonic sink and knowing his own vessel would soon follow it to the bottom. The frozen tableau of the crew could then be explained not by instant death, but by a quiet, collective acceptance. Carbon dioxide buildup doesn't always cause panic. In a confined space, it can cause a progressive lethargy, a peaceful slipping away into unconsciousness. The men stayed at their stations because there was nowhere else to go. They had completed their mission. They had signaled their victory, and with the oxygen thinning and the water rising around their boots, they simply sat back and waited for the Atlantic to claim them. Today, the 8 men of the Hunley lie in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery, buried with full military honors alongside the crews of the 2 previous failed missions. Their skeletons, once the center of a high-tech forensic investigation, are now at rest, but the submarine itself continues to undergo conservation in its chilled water tank. Every year, new layers of concretion are removed, and every year, the iron tells us a little more about that night in 1864. We now know the how, a combination of a concussive shockwave and a slow mechanical failure, but the why of their final, calm moments remains a testament to the iron-willed discipline of a crew that refused to break, even as the world around them turned to water. The blue light seen from the shore wasn't just a signal of victory. It was a final, flickering goodbye from a crew that knew they were never coming home. The engineering of the H.L. Hunley was a marvel of 19th-century improvisation, a testament to what minds can achieve when pushed to the absolute brink by the necessities of war. To understand why these men died so calmly, one must first understand the machine that became their tomb. The vessel was fashioned from a massive iron steam boiler, lengthened and tapered at both ends to create a streamlined hull. It was narrow, barely 4 feet tall, meaning the crew had to sit hunched, their knees nearly touching the iron walls. The propulsion system was entirely manual. A long iron crankshaft ran the length of the cabin, with 7 stagger handles for the crew to grip. As they turned the crank in unison, the propeller at the stern would bite into the water, pushing the 25-ton craft forward at a grueling 4 knots. There was no internal lighting save for a single candle. If the flame flickered and died, it was the crew's only warning that their oxygen was reaching a lethal low. While the blast lung theory provides a clinical explanation for their deaths, the artifacts found within the silt offer a more intimate, human narrative. During the excavation, archaeologists discovered that the men had not been stripped of their dignity by the sea. They found Lieutenant George Dixon's pocket watch, frozen forever at 8:23. Though historians debate if this was the exact time of the sinking or simply when the mechanism finally succumbed to corrosion. More famously, they found a $20 gold coin in Dixon's pocket. The coin was bent, bearing a deep indentation from a Union mini-ball. According to legend, the coin had been a gift from his sweetheart, Queenie Bennett, and it had saved his life at the Battle of Shiloh by stopping a bullet that would have pierced his thigh. On the back, Dixon had engraved the words, "Shiloh, April 6, 1862, my life preserver." Finding this life preserver inside the wreck was a poetic tragedy. The charm that had saved him from a bullet could not save him from the crushing physics of the harbor. The logistics of the recovery itself added another layer to the forensic mystery. When the submarine was raised in 2000, it was encased in a concretion, a hard, rock-like shell of sand, shells, and iron byproduct that had formed over 136 years. This shell acted as a natural time capsule, hermetically sealing the interior and preserving the organic materials. As the conservation team began the deconcretion process, using dental picks and small pneumatic chisels, they realized the sediment inside the boat was deposited in distinct layers. These layers told a story of how the water entered. If the boat had imploded or suffered a massive hull breach, the interior would have been scrambled. Instead, the fine silta layers suggested a slow, rhythmic infiltration. The boat likely settled on the seafloor intact, and for decades, the tides breathed silt into the tiny openings of the hull, slowly burying the men where they sat. The physics of the blast remain the primary focus for modern researchers at Duke University, who spent years modeling the exact pressure wave dynamics of the 135-pound black powder charge. Their research concluded that the Hunley was its own worst enemy. Because the submarine was submerged, the water around it acted as an incompressible medium. When the torpedo exploded against the Housatonic, it created a high-pressure front that moved through the water at the speed of sound. When this wave hit the iron hull of the Hunley, the metal didn't shatter. it vibrated, transmitting the energy into the air inside the cabin. This is known as transmission coefficient. The air inside the submarine was compressed so violently and so quickly that the soft tissues of the crew's lungs were shredded instantly. They didn't have time to gasp. They didn't have time to scream. The internal bleeding would have caused them to lose consciousness in seconds. However, the blue light paradox refuses to go away. If the crew died within seconds of the explosion, the signal seen by the men at Fort Moultrie becomes a ghost story. Some historians suggest the light wasn't a signal at all, but a secondary explosion or a trick of the light on the water. Others believe Dixon, perhaps seated furthest from the blast or shielded by the forward conning tower, survived the initial shock just long enough to perform one final duty. The lantern was found at his feet, not stowed in its bracket. This suggests it was in use. If he survived the blast, but realized the boat was sinking due to the sheared rivets and broken pipes, he may have spent his final moments of consciousness signaling the victory to ensure his men's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten by history. It is the image of a man dying in the dark, holding a flickering blue flame against the encroaching Atlantic that has kept the Hunley legend alive for over a century. The final burial of the crew in 2004 was the last Confederate funeral in history. Thousands of people, many in period dress, lined the streets of Charleston as the 8 coffins were carried by horse-drawn caissons to Magnolia Cemetery. They were laid to rest in a plot known as the Submarine Dead, joining the crews of the previous 2 fatal test runs. Forensic facial reconstructions were performed on the skulls before they were interred, giving names and faces to the men who had been the unknown 8 for 136 years. We saw the face of Frank Collins, the strong-jawed young man at the number 2 crank, Arnold Becker, the German immigrant seeking a new life, and Dixon himself, whose features matched the descriptions of the handsome, stoic officer from the archives. As the iron hull continues to sit in its 75,000-gallon tank of sodium hydroxide at the lash center, it is slowly being stripped of the salts that would cause it to disintegrate if exposed to the air. This process, known as electrochemical chloride extraction, takes decades. But with every passing year, the metal becomes more stable, and more of the boat's secrets are laid bare. We can now see the steering mechanism in detail, the way the depth gauges were calibrated, and the exact angle of the spar torpedo. We see a machine that was ahead of its time, a precursor to the U-boats and nuclear subs that would follow, born from a desperate ingenuity that ignored the laws of safety in favor of the laws of war. The H.L. Hunley stands as a haunting monument to the cost of innovation. It was a vessel that achieved the impossible, only to be consumed by the very power it unleashed. The mystery of why the men didn't try to escape has been solved by science, but the mystery of their courage remains. They knew the risks. They had seen 13 men die before them in the same iron tube, yet they stepped into the dark anyway. The blue light, whether it was a real signal or a collective memory of a hopeful city, remains the symbol of that night. A brief, brilliant flash of success followed by a long, silent darkness. The forensic evidence tells us how they died, but the way they were found tells us how they lived, disciplined, focused, and together. In the history of naval warfare, there are many stories of ships that went down fighting, but few are as chilling as the Hunley, where the fight ended so quickly that the fighters didn't even have time to let go of the handles. As the conservation of the hull nears its final stages, the Hunley will eventually be moved to a permanent museum, where future generations can look into that narrow iron corridor and wonder what it felt like in those final seconds. When the victory signal was lit, the world went quiet, and the fishboat began its long descent into history. The legacy of the Hunley is not just in its successful attack, but in the century of searching that followed. It reminds us that history is never truly buried. It is only waiting for the right tools to be unearthed. The 8 men at the crank were pioneers of a terrifying new frontier, and though they vanished for 136 years, their return has provided the world with an unparalleled look at the reality of the Civil War. A war fought not just on battlefields of grass and stone, but in the crushing depths of the sea, where the greatest enemy wasn't the Union Navy, but the very physics of the weapons they carried.